When an ambitious ruler sets their mind to a particular goal, nothing can shake them off of it. Even seemingly impossible achievements can feel not just doable, but deserved even. Entitlement to titles and the sense of grandeur that comes with an inflated self. Vampires have always been prideful and powerful. Some might even call them supremacist for their immortality and supernatural capabilities. Giselle, the High Queen of the former High Rock, now Greater Orsinium, is certainly not immune to pride. It's the dominating personality of the Prince Molag Bal that drives vampires to control and superiority. But Giselle is unique in that her patron is Malacath, whose domain is far from pride and superiority. Maybe it's because of that Giselle didn't descend into the degeneracy emblematic of places like Castle Volkihar. Regardless of why, Giselle maintained her faculties with the single-minded focus of uniting Tamriel into the vision that she saw in Hermaeus Mora's Black Book. She didn't see much, but what she did was enough to push her into her destiny. Uniting Tamriel will be no easy task, especially so early into the Second Era. Remember that the Third Era began in 2E 896 when Tiber Septim unified Tamriel, after which he would rule for 38 years and achieve apotheosis. The current year is 2E 566. Giselle is 330 years early, but luckily, as an immortal vampire, she's got all the time in the world, doesn't she? Let's get into the conquest of Tamriel, looking at the methods and consequences of the establishment of a Tamrielic empire. The most logical place to expand into first is, of course, the highly fractured region of Hammerfell. The reasoning is simple. It's on the border, and it'll be easy. First off, some of the lesser lords were willing to swear fealty to what they perceived as a far more powerful empire than they could handle, which would be a wise decision, given that like the other diplomatically acquired regions of Greater Orsinium, they'd be granted cultural and religious protection. There were still some Redguard kings who would not falter, but their downfall would be that any Redguard king or queen will have siblings that would do anything to take the throne. Redguards are famously bellicose, and the struggle between crowns and forebears within the region is quite exploitable. Most of Northeast Hammerfell submitted to Giselle's rule, including some of the Iron Oath orcs, who most likely just wanted to be left in peace. The Orcish king of Falkrenth, Gurgul, was also a follower of Malacath, but was too prideful to submit to his betters. That being said, when faced with a duel to the death for some of his land, he did not risk death, showing his cowardice to all. Giselle will come back to him later, since she has more important tasks to handle in Hammerfell. Across the Iliac Bay, the Ojwambu are Azura-worshipping forebear Redguards who don't control a particularly large region, but represent the floodgate to further expansion west. Rather than risk the ire of another Daedric lord, Giselle moved through the mountains in Verkarth. Using her scholarly ability to draw up fraudulent land claims, Giselle laid claim to the petty kingdom of Verkarth and marched in, marking the first war between Redguards and the Magnus Orcs. The war was short, with the Orsinium armies outnumbering the enemy and being far more disciplined. The issue of conquest would be more one of administration and justification than one of actual war. It's clear that Giselle's military will crush anyone it comes across, but controlling that land and justifying to the locals her hegemony will be difficult. The next target was Ojwambu, but not the Azura cultist kingdom, instead the breakaway Redguards inland from the kingdom proper. Again, the war was short. By taking this path, Giselle has managed to avoid fighting the Azura cultists for now, but with their kingdom surrounded and no word from Azura, it seems the Daedric prince may have abandoned them. Fortune favors the bold, and so Giselle declared a forced vassalization war with the intention to allow the king there to continue worshipping Azura as long as he remained a part of the empire. Surely that will work as a happy medium for Azura and Giselle's ambitions. Another kingdom added to the collection, and so Hammerfell seemed a trivial conquest, even though the task was not done yet. One of the larger powers of the region is the king of Sentinel, Harukar, but luckily one of Giselle's vassals, the chieftain Haldasan, was himself a claimant to the kingdom. Given that Giselle has no problem with local Redguards governing themselves, she declared war on her vassal's behalf to claim Sentinel. He was given the kingdom on condition that he reject the divines in favor of Malacath. The same situation occurred with Hegath, which was claimed by the crown Selima. Once again, with Ghislaine, did Kartos, another crown Redguard, claim a throne in return for loyalty to Malacath. From there, the first obstacle to the Hammerfell conquest came up, which was Queen Juna of Anvil and Hugh's Bane. She's an Imperial with a much stronger realm than any of the wayward Redguard kingdoms. Alongside that, she rules 2 thrones, making it difficult to claim her land with just one claimant. Protus Olo was a claimant to both kingdoms, and so he was invited to Orsinium to serve as the proxy king, who would be elevated from nothing to a king. Rather than fight 2 wars against a powerful queen though, Giselle used Crotus' knowledge of the Anvil court to begin a plot to end the queen's life. If she dies, her kingdom will be split between her children, fracturing the realm and making Crotus' ascension that much easier. While that plot chugs along, the archipelago kingdom of Mitana was next, and already one of the Orsinium Redguard kings had a claim, so war was swiftly declared. King Selima, although old, still had claims and fight left in him. During the war with Mitana, Queen Juna was killed, splitting Anvil in 2. Although to be fair, the kingdom of Anvil ruled a far larger portion than Hugh's Bane, so it was more like Anvil lost a few splinters. Unfortunately, Selima passed away before the war in Mitana could be completed, and so the war effort was wasted. For now, the conquest of Anvil was prioritized, and Giselle prepared her army to sail into the westernmost portion of Cyrodiil. The armies first met in Ghislaine, as Giselle feigned an invasion only to turn around to confront the Anvil counter-invasion. Afterwards, she did properly sail for Castle Anvil. After taking the castle, she sailed back again to Ghislaine, defeating the enemy on the battlefield once more. With a few more occupations in the Anvil hinterlands, the Imperials surrendered, and Anvil was taken. Hearing news of Anvil's capture, some lords nearby swore fealty in fear. So far, about half of the Tamrielic west coast has been conquered, and soon the mighty kingdom of Bruma will share a border with Orsinium. Bruma has filled the power vacuum left behind by the Potentates, and whether they can resist the Orcish onslaught is yet to be seen. For a brief time, there was peace enough for Giselle's armies to reinforce and for her to build up some money through raiding. Even the armies of Malacath need a break once in a while. The next target was Tanith, an insolent Redguard kingdom on the border with Cyrodiil. The queen was captured in her capital and swiftly removed from her throne. Tanith City itself would remain the direct domain of Giselle, as she liked the beautiful tower of the Fifth Doctrine there. The remaining land in Hammerfell was easily mopped up, with short wars and offers of vassalage handed out in equal measure. In Second Era 586, on the 19th of Rain's Hand, Giselle was crowned High Queen of Hammerfell by right of conquest, and she spent some time ensuring the total control of the legal territory of the Empire. Once she pulled that off, she was able to establish a lingua Tamrielis, thanks to the immense cultural influence that her new empire held. No longer was Greater Orsinium just some empire in the far reaches of High Rock, but instead the empire was an ever-present idea in the minds of all Tamriel's inhabitants. The minting of coins and the commonality of Bredic-speaking merchants led to a common trade and diplomatic language for Tamriel, that being Bredic. Despite being orcs, most of the people spoke Bredic simply because all the writing of Greater Orsinium and all the chronicles were already written in Bredic, so the language stuck. At this point, the Empire of Tamriel has already begun to take shape. From here, the next phase of the Conquest of Tamriel began, with Anvil being a staging ground to move further into Cyrodiil and Nibelheim. Giselle had her eyes locked on the white gold tower, which she had already been shown by Hermaeus Mora. The Ruby Throne has been vacant for some time now, since both the Akaviri and the Imperials had failed to assert their authority throughout just Cyrodiil, let alone Tamriel. In the period known as the Interregnum, various factions would vie for control of Tamriel in a conflict known as the Three Banners War. If you play Elder Scrolls Online, that's the war your characters are fighting when you visit Cyrodiil. In that game, Molag Bal and his armies would attempt an invasion of Tamriel during the conflict, but I'm pretty sure most of ESO isn't canon, so we'll ignore that, and instead rewrite history with Malacath's Breton Orc Confederation invading from High Rock. This does bring up the question of whether or not the invasion is Malacath or Hermaeus Mora's responsibility. Would Queen Giselle have even wanted to invade Tamriel without Hermaeus Mora's Black Book? Would she have had the capability to defeat Tamriel's fractured kingdoms without Malacath? Maybe it's Molag Bal's fault because she was a vampire. All this blame shifting and discussion was a further fracturing effect on the rest of Tamriel. You'd think that with Orcish hordes flooding into the rest of Tamriel, there'd be a concerted effort to fight them off, but instead most of Cyrodiil's lords were too busy arguing over who to blame. This was of course to Giselle's benefit, as she took the opportunity to continue recruiting traitorous claimants to expand her realm. Crotus, the claimant king of Anvil, also held claims to Chorol, and this is where I'm going to start glossing over some of these seemingly important but ultimately minor wars. See, places like Kvatch and Chorol are kingdoms, which would make you think they're big conquests, but these kingdoms are weak and without alliances. Each of the Cyrodiilic kingdoms fell without any issue. The only real rival of Greater Orsinium, albeit rival is a strong word, is King Stenvar, the Scald Prince of Bruma. He too was a vampire, standing at 150 years of age, and he held the Imperial City alongside a relatively well-governed kingdom. He had vassal support and no claimants willing to fight against him. For the first time in Greater Orsimer history, Giselle proclaimed a war not based on a claimant, but instead on the right of her patron, Malacath. She declared a holy war against the divine following Brumans and invaded the heartlands of Cyrodiil. The whole war, Giselle always kept the White Gold Tower in view, knowing it would soon be the center of her empire. Using her elite Orcish army, the Brumans were absolutely crushed. No one bests an orc, they say, and that was proving true against even the united and strong armies of Bruma. Nibelheim and Cyrodiil's great bully, the Cyro Nords, have been knocked down a peg, which somehow, despite knowing that Giselle was fighting on the side of the Prince of the Scorned, left many Heartlander locals praising her. It seems the reign of the vampire Stenvar was not well loved. The Heartlanders of the Imperial Isle and its neighboring coasts would not find in Giselle a savior, but instead a conqueror. That being said, the Imperial City itself was not to be touched on Giselle's order. She made it her new capital and the whole realm was shifted to the White Gold Tower. Local Heartlander power holders would be granted new land that was taken from the Cyro Nords in return for their allegiance to Malacath, which some accepted and some didn't. With a truce signed, Giselle would need a new warpath which could take her outside of the old Potentate's borders. She made an incursion into Valenwood, which was also disunified by this point. the Bosmer were stuck between the Alinori Empire and the Orcimer Empire. Alinor had invaded the southwest of the continent a while ago, exerting its influence in Valenwood, and while the Bosmers certainly didn't like that, they also didn't like the Orcish Empire. That being said, it was well known by now that Giselle often left the locals in charge of their land, although an oath of loyalty to Malacath was demanded. At the very least under the Orcs, they'd be ruled by a Bosmer at the local level. The snooty Altmer of Alinor would never let a Bosmer rule. For that reason, at least a few Bosmeri claimants did come forward, with Sylvanar coming under Orsinium's control. One of the cities there is an important site for Malacath worshippers, Avamath. This is most likely because it was once the home of the now extinct Wood Orcs. After these conquests, Giselle took some time to travel and survey the realm. She passed by some academies and holy sites and let the realm enjoy some peace. Briefly, she also hosted a tournament in the arena to celebrate her conquest. They would engage in some merry wrestling and horse races, both of which Giselle herself won. Having won in the arena, she declared a renewed war against Bruma, looking to cut off the snake's head. Giselle invaded Bruma proper and swiftly won the war. The Scald Prince lost control of his personal domain, which would inevitably collapse his realm. The army shifted attention back to Valenwood, with a claimant against Grotwood pledging allegiance to the new empire after hearing of Bruma's fall. At this point, to be quite frank, Giselle, and even I, the narrator, are both getting bored of these simple conquests. So I'm going to do us all a favor and just montage the peace deals to show you what CBs Giselle was citing and which regions fell and in what order. The details of these conquests can be left to boring military history manuals where every single battle will just be, and then the Orcs won because there were more of them and they were stronger. Also, the Knight Harkon was scary. Making great progress into Blackmarsh, elsewhere, Valenwood, Skyrim, and even Morrowind, Giselle had been at war for some decades. She chose to proclaim herself the High Queen of Cyrodiil, citing it as a much more accurate description for her empire. By this point, the Imperial City had been settled by Magnus Orcs, and its shrines were converted to Malacath temples, where sacrifices were not just mandatory, but enforced by law. The remaining lands to conquer were southern Elsewhere, the remnants of Skyrim, some bits of Blackmarsh that didn't submit peacefully, and then Morrowind and Alinor, which would be the most difficult of all to take. Alinor was united and stood strong under their High Kinlord, and stood staunchly against any de-jure worshippers. Morrowind was fractured, but each of the houses individually was about as strong as Alinor, and the terrain of places like Vardenfell and Necrom made conquest simply inconvenient. While completing her conquest of western Skyrim, Giselle put out letters, as she had always done, asking that any claimants to the houses of Morrowind who want to rule can come to her, but the houses of Morrowind did not have any claimants willing to betray their people. This is quite out of character, especially for houses like Hulalu, but it seems like the Dunmer prefer to bicker amongst themselves. Maybe it was the Umsivi keeping the houses in check, but the false gods of the tribunal won't resist Malacath's wrath for long. The king of Leyawiin submitted to the empire without any fight, but he would come to regret the decision, as upon arriving in the area, Giselle ordered the destruction of the bridges of Leyawiin in order to force trade into imperial ports. This would have disastrous effects on the Leyawiin economic situation, but it would bring much prosperity and control to Giselle as the new empress of Cyrodiil. Off in Morrowind, House Dress collapsed under its own weight, perhaps there was an Argonian slave revolt or something. I wasn't paying attention, but this allowed Giselle to vassalize much of the southernmost region of Morrowind, as the Argonians just didn't want to be slaves. As bad as Malacath might seem, it was not legal to enslave anyone in this new empire. During a war in eastern Skyrim, tragedy, or perhaps a blessing depending on who you ask, struck the imperial court, with the emperor consort Harkon staked in his coffin bed on the 28th day of Sun's Height, 2nd Era 644. A murderer, perhaps from the Dark Brotherhood, was abound in the empire, taking out key figures, and who knew if Giselle herself was on the list. More so, the empire had lost one of its greatest knights with his death. Rather than just accept this, Giselle began studying up on necromancy to see if she could bring back at least something of Harkon. She also remarried a talented Bosmer, not to try and have more kids, but more because the emperor consort wasn't just a marital position, it was also an important administrative position. Harkon, in his time as the consort, had kept many local lords in check, and Giselle's new husband, Enethorn, will be doing the same. Although she was relatively new to necromancy, Giselle got started with an ambitious creature to bring up. She raised the bones of the dragon Thurvelkund from Fang Lair. If it wasn't clear that Giselle would rule all of Tamriel, it certainly was now, with a skeletal dragon flying above the Orcish armies. The Septims may have been dragonborn, but Giselle is above even dragons. During a battle in Sothasil City, the Dunmer laid eyes upon the glorious Orcimer army and were absolutely slaughtered in a battle on the 13th of Heartfire, 2nd Era 646. This day would later be known as the day that the unshakable faith in the tribunal began to falter. For whatever reasons, Almalexia, Vivek, and Sothasil himself simply refused to help. Shortly after, the brave Nords, descendants of Atmora and the 500 companions, submitted to yet another dragon in shame. They had thought they swore off being ruled by dragons, but now Giselle and her pet ruled all of Skyrim. She reunified Skyrim shortly after, ending the west and east split of the region. In many ways, Giselle brought the Nords together after they had been split by their own petty disputes. Solstheim fell soon after without much of a fuss, being allowed to keep their queen as long as she served the Empire. Surveying her land, the Code of Malacath had been kept relatively far away from most of the Empire. Only Hammerfell so far had seen large amounts of conversion in and around Sentinel. The cult of Azura continued to live on there as well, just as Giselle had hoped. In the Imperial City proper, Malacath was the new master of the city, but beyond that, the Divines held sway over the vast majority of the Cyrodiilic plains. To better legitimize herself as Empress, Giselle adopted the local Cyrodiilic language as her new court language, hoping to embrace her role as Empress and evoke images of figures like Riemann. She also made an effort to convince the Dunmer to join the Empire peacefully, as she appointed a local Dunmer lord to control most of southern Morrowind, betraying the Argonians that longed for freedom there. Although technically outlawed, the Dunmer implemented new ways to enslave the Argonians legally in the Empire, like creating indentured servitude systems, or paying the Argonians pittances for their work, which they would only be allowed to spend at company stores and so on. Slavery was back in Imperial Morrowind, but rebranded as right-to-work campaigns. Sadly, this only served to upset the Argonians and did not leave the Dunmer houses convinced that they should join the Empire. It was rumored that Vivek had control over a legendary dwarven colossus known as the Numidium, and that he had the heart of the silent god with which he could control it, and many Dunmer implored him that he use it, but Vivek believed he was fated to make peace with the Empire by handing the Numidium over to a Dragonborn. This alarmed him, since the Empire was not led by a Dragonborn, and the prophecy was not believed to be coming for at least another 200 or so years. Immediately, Vivek realized that Giselle, the High Queen of Cyrodiil, must have achieved Chim in order to break the fated prophecies that had governed Nirn. With that revelation, Vivek knew that he stood no chance, and reserved himself to a life of writing and thought. The Tribunal Temple seemed to have abandoned Morrowind, but the Dunmer wouldn't give up so easily. Each of the houses rallied and prepared their forces for a great struggle. While they prepared, Giselle went on a campaign for Elsewhere. She still believed that she could convince the Dunmer to join the Empire without so much bloodshed, and to show good faith, left them to their devices for some time. They would only use that time to prepare rather than make peace. During her first invasion of Elsewhere, strange but fortunate news reached Giselle as heralds announced the dissolution of Alinor. After their crushing defeat in Valenwood, many of the Altmer felt that they could no longer trust the High Kinlord and dismantled the entire Union. Alinor was no more, instead just a disunified Summerset Isle. In some ways this will complicate the conquest of the Isle, given that there are more political factions to outmaneuver and subjugate, compared to just dealing with one political entity, but it certainly is a sign that the Altmer are in a weakened state. Nonetheless, having not received any sign of submission from the Dunmer, Giselle began her conquest, starting by circumventing the strong Dunmer houses, and instead going to the northeast. She found some Telvanni lords there who had split from their house, and who were looking for vengeance. Finally, traitorous Dunmer looking to join the Empire. These Dunmer would be scorned by later Morrowind sources as being the reason that the Empire was able to conquer Morrowind. The Peninsula of Firewatch and the island Telvannis both submitted to Imperial control. They gave up information about the weakness in House Redoran's control over their borderlands in Skyrim, upon which Giselle immediately acted. She declared a war for Velothis, and thus the noble Redorans found themselves at war with a target they had no chance against. The Redoran warriors were well trained and numerous, but the power of a dragon and orcs in handcrafted orichalcum armor had no chance. In the Battle of Aldera, the Redorans fought bravely but were defeated unequivocally. To further humiliate the Dunmer, Giselle had even appointed one of the traitorous Dunmer in full bone mold armor as commander. Seeing their brothers fight against them was demoralizing and showed the houses that they were still, ultimately, a bunch of interwarring people who couldn't unify to save themselves. That was what Giselle thought, but upon checking the regalia of her foes in Aldera, it turns out this was a House of Lalu army. The houses had unified, it seems. In the siege along the coast, even more Dunmer arrived to join the fight, a bit late but nonetheless there. These Dunmer were of House Redoran. Nonetheless, even the true Redorans were defeated hastily. The dragon Thurvelkun and the supporting Orcish army were too much for them. It wasn't until all the Dunmer houses united for a fight in Vanato that the Orcish army tasted defeat for the first time. The armies retreated back across the border into Skyrim, and although a minor defeat, it did fill the Dunmer with resolve. After getting reinforcements from Skyrim, the army turned back around and marched into Velothis once more. The army the Dunmers had defeated were just a simple welcoming party. Now the full army was here, ready to battle. In Adoran, tens of thousands of Dunmer House soldiers piled in, only to be slaughtered. It was an absolute disaster, with Aldera being re-sieged right away. A few more skirmishes occurred before the Redorans surrendered control of the coast to Giselle. From here, more and more of Morrowind fell, without any house being able to put up any resistance nearly comparable to the Redorans. In Second Era 663, the siege of Vivec City itself began with Orcish armies ravaging the various districts, all while watching Bardau hover above them. For some Dunmer, the Malacath invasion confirmed the rumor that Bardau was in fact a piece of Malacath's feces that had been flung there, rather than being some rock that Sheogorath threw. Of course, scholars still debated it anyway, as the Dung story just wasn't very satisfying. When the Temple of Vivec fell, Vivec himself was nowhere to be found. He had been missing for some time, and whether he'll return or not is unknown to the Dunmer people. Nonetheless, had the Malacath armies killed Vivec, then Bardau would have fallen into the city, so it's probably for the best that Vivec would be allowed to live. A treaty was signed with House Olalu, who gave up the great city in return for peace. Imperial presence on Vardenfell began, and as Giselle had been doing so far, she appointed the local Dunmers to rule the land in their stead. She then continued her campaign in Elsewhere, which I'd talk about more, but Elsewhere simply didn't have a chance at resistance. The important central city of Orcrest fell without much of a fight, as did Senchal soon after. All of the local Elsewhere rulers were cut off from the coast, leaving just Albasti as an enclave within the Empire, hoping to fight them off desperately. Only a truce kept them safe. Say what you will about the Empire, but it did honor all of its truces and treaties. The last real resistance in Morrowind was under House Olalu, which was snuffed out after Giselle invaded Narcissus and large portions of Mournhold. House Redoran had retreated to the Ashlands, where they were hoping to hold out in the volcanic lands around Red Mountain, but Giselle's armies simply braved the fire and ash, defeating the Redorans, with their only casualties really coming from the hostile fauna and the general inhospitable conditions of the region. With one last major war against House Olalu, Giselle was able to control enough of Morrowind to declare herself the High Queen of the newly established Imperial Province based out of Vivec City. Simultaneously, the conquest of Elsewhere was completed, leaving just some Redoran and Olalu holdouts to conquer. All the loot from the Morrowind campaign was reinvested into the ruins of Orsinium, as work began on restoring the great city to its former glory. Although sometimes the Orcs and Bretons back in High Rock felt ignored, Giselle made it clear to them that she knew where her true home was. The vast majority of her income from the Empire was invested in Wayrest and Orsinium, as those cities were elevated to secondary capitals of the Empire. After crowning herself the High Queen of the newly proclaimed province of Dunminium, the houses of Redoran, Indoril, and Halalu were forced into submission. House Indoril, up to now, had been too small and irrelevant to be worth mentioning, but they did exist in the hinterlands of Necrom. Redoran and Halalu still exist in the Empire as subsidiaries of the Empire, and with their conquest complete, all of Tamriel, except the Summerset Isles, has been unified. In Dunminium, the last hope any Dunmer had for freedom was the Nerevarine prophecy and the return of the Hortator, but with Vivec having abandoned the Dunmer, the legitimacy of prophecies was falling into question. With every region of mainland Tamriel conquered, there remained only one last holdout, the fractured Summerset Isles. While traditionally Alinor was a unified and harmonious region, it seems that the news of the encroaching empire across the seas had spread panic and despair amongst the Alinori nobility. The Summerset Isles are a fractured mess of bickering lords, and for some reason, one Ashlander off in the Kingdom of Alinor. Not sure how that happened. The first obvious step for invading Alinor is to go through Auradon, which is the large island to the east of the main island. Auradon is split between three realms, all of whom should fall relatively easily. Again, citing Holy Conquest in Malacath's name, Giselle sailed across the sea to Vulkel. After a brief scuffle with the locals, they were defeated, and the first piece of the isle was added to the empire. The rest of Auradon fell soon after. Again, I'm mostly skipping past the simple conquests because there isn't much to say. Auradon would act as a staging ground for the rest of the invasion of the Isles, with traitorous Altmer flocking to the island, practically flaunting their claims to places like Shimmerine and Alinor. First was Cyrillindi, an Altmer who had a claim to Shimmerine. She was easily placed on the throne and promptly swore loyalty to the Empire and Malacath. Next was Cloudrest, which would be claimed for Itermerel in the same fashion as Shimmerine. A claim to Lilandril popped up as well, and although they all saw themselves as rightful rulers that were robbed of their birthrights, to Giselle, they were just pawns. The next target was Sunhold, which Giselle declared on simply citing her immense strength and fame instead of using a claimant. The conquest of Sunhold should have been like any other conquest, with Giselle not necessarily getting complacent, but simply being bored. While the soldiers were landing in the southwest of Sunhold, Giselle was observing from her ship. A beachhead was made, and she walked onto the, quite honestly, beautiful Summerset Isle. She did always find that most regions of Tamriel were beautiful, and the effect of a new land could never be understated. She did miss seeing Tamriel in the day, and she couldn't stand in the sun without slowly burning alive. That being said, she wasn't always paying close attention to those around her, and suddenly, in the fray of logistics and discussion about plans and so on, a Dunmer among the army rushed at the queen with a knife. Just no ordinary Dunmer though, as he was able to act faster than Giselle with her vampiric abilities. This Dunmer was himself a vampire. Not just that, he was a Morag Tong assassin. This must have been the revenge of the cursed Dunmer, and although the Morag Tong agent escaped, everyone saw it happen. Giselle was dying on the ground, a knife right in her heart. Before she passed away, she took in the beauty of the Summerset Isles, and then turned to dust, as all vampires do when they die. Most of the Cyrodiilic nobility hadn't even considered what would happen if Giselle were to die, but in theory, the next of kin would be her daughter by Harkon, Gwyn. In all honesty, Giselle hadn't exactly taken the time to groom her children, presuming that because she was immortal, she wouldn't have to, and suddenly Gwyn found herself given the most powerful throne on Nirn. Immediately, her elder sister, Serana, yes, that one, challenged her for the throne by the Code of Malacath. It was only because of the immensely high-quality armor and weapons that Gwyn had that she was able to fend off the Nord vampire, and it was also thanks to this that her lords would come to see her as perhaps a worthy candidate. The whole realm had been afraid of Harkon, Valyrica, and Serana when they lived, but now the House Draconis has defeated all of them. Despite being the spawn of 2 vampires, Gwyn herself was not a vampire. She was just another Breton that was touched by Magnus during the Great Orc Redemption. She was, for all intents and purposes, normal. She wasn't even a follower of Malak, but rather she looked to the stars for guidance. She'd grown up looking at the stars while waiting for her mother to come home from campaigns that never ended. She did decide to become a follower of Malacath right away though, for she feared being a pariah amongst even the pariah folk. Her conversion may have been genuine, given the immense praise she was given for defeating Serana. Keep in mind, this is a woman in her 60s that hasn't lived a day outside of the White Gold Tower, and who was ignored by both her parents. Any praise is high praise. Rather than immediately jump into further conquest, Gwyn sat on her throne and handled some of the affairs that her realm had allowed to backlog. First of all, many of the conquered peoples of the Empire were looking for freedom with the death of Giselle. The Dunmer wanted their slaves back, the Nords wanted to fight for freedom, as they often do. The Redguards couldn't stand that the Empire had mostly ignored the Four-Baron Crown feud, taking a neutral stance, which to both sides of the issue was the wrong stance. The movement was headed up by a Khajiit queen in the south who was outraged at the removal of the spiritual leader of Elsewhere from his position. To solve the issue, Gwyn handed out expensive gifts to the grumbling vassals, hoping that they would rescind their support. Some of them did, and the independence movement seemed to be dying down, but ultimately some of the Khajiit and the Nords would lead a rebellion that was actually quite underwhelming. It featured a large contingent of Dunmer and even some Redguards. Gwyn was, at first, somewhat afraid, but upon surveying the maps and getting an idea of how large the rebellion was, it became clear that this would be a footnote in history. She raised her armies near the Khajiit capital Riverkeep and proceeded to win every battle without any struggle, and hold the Khajiiti capital long enough that the ill-fated rebellion surrendered right away. Because of her Orcish heritage, Gwyn had the opportunity to extract from her foes a blood price, which, although not useful materially, would give her immense respect from her subjects, and don her with Malacath's favor. After the rebellion, Gwyn endeavored to be a better empress. She began studying the various languages of the realm, and visited a university to learn the history of all the peoples that her empire ruled. There was much history to read indeed, and with luck, she'd be writing new history for all of them soon. After some festivities and studying time, Gwyn finally began the campaign to complete the conquest of Summerset Isle. While her mother had done the vast majority of the work, she was blessed with the right to complete the conquest. Her first target was Dusk, which fell with ease. Afterwards, she invited a claimant in to take down Alinor, leaving Sunhold, the place of her mother's death, for last. Sunhold's cities and castles were well fortified, but their army was off in the mountains of the north doing God knows what, so the kingdom fell without a single battle. This only left the Mehrunes Dagon worshipping pirates of Sea Viper's Landing and some remnant rump states from the dissolution of the Kingdom of Dusk. With the conquest of the pirates, Gwyn declared herself the Empress of the province of Summerset, murdered the King of Dusk, with whom she had a truce, and then vassalized all but one of the lords that remained there. The county of Gilera was the final step to a unified Tamriel, and although they did try to survive, it was in vain. The county was easily conquered and granted to the newly crowned King Dugan of Sunhold post-haste. Gwyn returned home to her people in the Imperial City, bearing news of the completion of Tamriel's conquest. She was praised by all for it, except perhaps subjects that had something to lose from her conquests. Rather than stay Empress of Cyrodiil, Gwyn declared herself Empress of all Tamriel, and the Third Era began in Second Era 710. In the game, the date didn't change to Third Era 1 yet, but I believe that in the next patch, the mod developers have intended to make it do that. Pretty neat. Here's the thing with uniting Tamriel. You keep all the other empires. Now look, I get it. These empire titles are like the provinces of the empire, and we want them to keep those borders and all. I completely understand. You'd need an even higher level title than empire to really represent the Tamrielic Empire. Alas, we only have 5 title levels. I do, however, as an orc, have the special ability to actually, truly unify the continent and Summerset Isle into one true de-jure empire. So in my game, I let things run for a little while. I wanted to see if everything would just immediately collapse or not. Things did not collapse. Tamriel is completely stable, and I'm glad to see that. I went on pilgrimages to get some piety, and just because I didn't have much to do now, I wanted to play this out at least until Gwyn's death, given that she's our Tiber Septim allegory of the game. First of all, the Empire needs a new faith to unite its people. We can't ignore Malacath, but given the fact that de-jure worshippers rule the entire continent, and they have been for about a century now, it's not far-fetched to imagine that de-jure worship in general has become more accepted. It has, in fact, become so accepted that a new faith in Tamriel has cropped up. This is the Tamrielic de-jure worship faith, which is based on the code of Malacath, but which also enjoys a little bit of divine syncretism. This faith is very personal to each of its members, with the chief divines being a secondary pantheon, namely Akatosh, Zenithar, and Julianos. I picked those three because Zenithar appeals to orcish craftsmanship, Julianos to the role Magnus played in the story, and Akatosh because he is the most prestigious of the divines. Alongside that pantheon, I've added every Daedric prince to the pantheon except Meridia, since she won't join the pantheon unless we outlaw necromancy. I removed all restrictions morally from the faith, with lycanthropy, vampirism, adultery, deviancy, and so on all becoming accepted. This is to, somewhat, demonstrate the less judgmental aspect of the de-jure worshipper lifestyle. It would be hard to denounce others when you yourself have been denounced all your life. This faith isn't meant to be one that the vast majority of the realm converts to, as it focuses on plurality and adaptability, although because it makes every de-jure a pantheon member, it ends up being seen as evil by even the other de-jure cults, so that's unfortunate. Regardless, there won't be any massive regions of Tamrielic de-jure worship, but instead an acceptance by all the peoples of Tamriel, given that it's mostly a live and let live system. The next development was back in the Imperial Isle, with the Magnus Orcs having lived on the island for some time now. They've really begun to connect with the Heartlanders, and for that reason, they formed a hybrid in 3rd Era 7, or 2nd Era 717, as the game shows it. The Imperial Orcs are the most illustrious of all the Orcs, but more importantly, they are no longer really even Orcs, to be honest. They are Cyrodiilic by language and heritage, inheriting only the egalitarian attitude of the Iliac Bretons they hybridized with all that time ago. Here's why that matters. We can now reintegrate Orsinium, which is a nice way of saying we can destroy Orsinium once again, and banish the Orcs to being pariah folk once again. Now look, we've been cooperative with the Orcs for a long time, but I don't intend to stop that. But you see, Orsinium has to be destroyed so that it can be reborn again, but even better this time. I destroyed Orsinium, and immediately established it again, and because Orsinium has been reborn, I can now revive Greater Orsinium, and guess what that does? Yes, it does indeed take all the de-jure land from every empire control and put it into Greater Orsinium. We have now, truly, completely unified Tamriel under one empire. This is both one empire legally and de facto. All that remains now is to destroy all my other empire titles. I didn't have enough prestige to do quite all of them, so I had to wait before destroying Skyrim, but once I did, there were truly no provinces of Tamriel, only one great province governed directly by the Empress. To commemorate this great realm, Gwyn paid homage to her lord Malacath and granted him sovereignty over the continent, naming it Malacath's Plane of Oblivion. What he'll do with his new plane is something that denizens of the 3rd Era will have to find out. It's only been 7 years so far in the 3rd Era, and already society appears to be undergoing a massive change. I suppose that is why eras are marked, aren't they? The next couple years entailed simple living and the joys of victory for Gwyn. Unlike her parents, she is not a vampire, and so is not immortal, spurring her on to try out the various aspects of life. One day, she met with traders from old Yokuda, who had heard of the rise of a Tamrielic empire. They brought many foreign things, and Gwyn liked them so much that she welcomed some of them to her court. Increasingly, she became more and more influenced by these noble Redguard warriors and traders. Eventually, after picking up the language like a natural, she actually adopted Yokuda culture herself, and welcomed many Redguards from overseas to settle in the Imperial City. After some time enjoying their company, the Imperial Orcs of the Heartlands also enjoyed the Yoku presence, and yet another hybrid of the truly cosmopolitan region emerged. This time, influence from the far-off old Yokuda added to the mixture, but having moved on from her somewhat childish love for random foreign cultures, Gwyn returned to her Imperial Orc origins. This decision exists, by the way, because when I formed Yoku Orc culture, it completely converted the Imperial Orcs, and any Orc is allowed to convert to a dead Orcish culture, whose nativity region is where the capital is. I'm not sure if there are more specific requirements, but yeah, it allowed me to swap cultures several times in a very short period of time. By 3rd Era 11, there was a divide of Yoku Orcs and Imperial Orcs, with the Imperials living in the north of the island and the Yoku living in the south and exterior. There was no enmity, as they all viewed each other as brothers, and in celebration of Tamriel's great diversity, Gwyn hosted a festival to celebrate the many foreign cultures in the realm. It was prohibitively expensive, given just how much cultural acceptance I've built up with so many cultures, but I think it's a very wholesome way to end things off. Nothing much else really happened from here. I was just going to play things out until Gwyn died. She became infirm at one point, and then I was getting bored, so I reset my perks and didn't assign them, depriving me of the whole of body trait. With that, Gwyn's health quickly plummeted, and she died at 90 years of age in 3rd Era 14. She did not ascend to godhood how Tiber Septim did in the canon lore, but maybe Gwyn failed to achieve Chim due to not really being the conqueror of Tamriel. Giselle, of course, wasn't granted apotheosis because she was a vampire. Either way, there are about 170 years left in the game, and I could keep going, but I think this is an appropriate send-off. The game ends in 2nd Era 896 because that's when. If you enjoyed this style of storytelling video, leave a like and subscribe. Thank you for your time. I'll also end my game at the 3rd Era, plus a decade and a half for the epilogue purposes. You could probably write all sorts of fanfiction about this new Tamriel under Malacath's rule as a new plane. Maybe we could even see Malacath ascended from de-jure to becoming a divine or something. You could be the only de-juric Aedra or something. Who knows? My role in this story has ended. I hope you enjoyed this little foray into mods for CK3. I'm eagerly awaiting the next patch in DLC, so I've gone to mods to help fill the time. I don't normally play mods, but this one was just too good to skip out on. Huge congratulations to the development team for the mod, this was truly something. I remember loving Elder Kings for CK2, and I had high expectations for Elder Kings 2. I had tried it out a long time ago when it first came out, but it was relatively bare bones back then. Now it's quite fleshed out, and I'm really happy to see how it's going. I look forward to more updates.